Hello, I'm Amber Alexander. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor in California, as well as a licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas. I have created this Understanding Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder for my Boise State Ed Tech 522 class. I want to take a minute to mention that the purpose of this training is purely educational. This is not meant to replace actual treatment with a professional. So if you are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or are not sure if you have PTSD, I would encourage you to reach out to your provider, or if you need help locating one, going online and locating one in your local area. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, everything starts from that traumatic event. And we'll go into details a little bit more about what a traumatic event is. But these are the four categories of symptoms that individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder experience: intrusive memories, avoidance, negative thoughts and mood, arousal, and reactivity. The traumatic event can be experienced firsthand, witnessed, or it could be trauma experienced at work. For instance, if you're working in the military or you're a first responder, such as an EMT, firefighter, working in the medical field, so on and so forth, you may experience trauma in your work. Trauma experienced indirectly has to be a case of actual threatened death, violent or accidental death. The trauma is defined as death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or sexual violence. So the post-traumatic stress disorder intrusion symptoms include intrusive memories, nightmares and flashbacks, and physiological reactions. So the avoidance symptoms with post-traumatic stress disorder include avoiding anything that's distressing related to the trauma, avoiding thinking about or talking about the trauma, so it won't bring up trauma-related thoughts and feelings, avoiding trauma-related external reminders, such as avoiding certain people, certain places, certain activities, or certain objects because they remind you of the trauma. So with the mood and thought symptoms, you'll see here there's a number of different areas and possible symptoms. The first one is the distorted negative beliefs, thinking that I am bad or the world is completely dangerous. Diminished interest in activities, so you're no longer interested in activities that you used to enjoy. Feeling alienated or detached or estranged from others, so the inability to feel connected in a relationship with friends or family or significant others. The inability to experience positive emotions. Distorted blame or self or others for the traumatic event or the consequences. For example, you may hold yourself responsible for what happened during that traumatic event, or you may blame someone else for that traumatic event occurring and really hang on to that blame. Negative trauma-related emotions such as fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. The arousal symptoms include irritability or being aggressive. This can include self-destructive behavior and sleep disturbances. Individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder often have difficulty sleeping. They might have difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. They may be awakened during the night because of nightmares. And so, again, that sleep disturbance is quite common. Hypervigilance. This is just being overly aware of one's surroundings, always being on guard and looking around for threats, maybe looking around, always having an exit strategy in mind, and so on and so forth. Having an exaggerated startle response. So someone comes up at work and just out of the blue, walks by your office. You might have an overreaction to that and be very startled. Difficulty concentrating is another arousal post-traumatic stress disorder symptom that's quite common. Some of the barriers for individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of getting treatment or barriers when they're on their jobs is that people with post-traumatic stress disorder have difficulty communicating and forming relationships. Again, that comes from some of the negative thought processes and feeling detached from other people. They may be withdrawn or have an abrupt communication style. They may be perceived as hostile or aggressive, or they may have inappropriate boundaries. So again, that perception of that individual can be, if they're coming across as overly aggressive or hostile, that the other person might be taken aback and might, pull away from that person, and again, perpetuating that cycle of difficulty connecting with others and difficulty with communication. One thing I want us to really think about and realize is that not everyone who experiences trauma will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. There are lots of individuals who experience a traumatic event, and following that traumatic event, experience a lot of distress and may exhibit some of the symptoms that we mentioned earlier. However, within a few months, those symptoms go away and that person returns to their prior level of functioning, for example. So not everyone who goes through a traumatic event is going to actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms that we mentioned earlier, in order to be categorized as a disorder, have to be significantly impacting your relationships or your occupational work environment. There is 7 to 8% of the American population who will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And among military veterans, that's even higher. But it's important to remember sometimes we have this perception that everybody who's been to combat or Iraq or Afghanistan is going to come home with PTSD. The data suggests that number is around 11 to 20% of those who have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan come home with PTSD. That 20% again is, it's still fairly high. That we're talking about 1 in 5 people. But again, sometimes we have that stigma attached that if somebody has been through that event or traumatic event, then they have PTSD. They might have some residual symptoms. They may have experienced some of the PTSD symptoms following that event. But again, 1 in 5 at most are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, this can be a very intimidating topic and very confusing for a lot of people. However, post-traumatic stress disorder occurs because we have this survival mechanism set up in our brain to be afraid and fearful when we're in a dangerous situation. So that survival mechanism gets turned on when we experience trauma. The part of our brain that keeps us alive during a traumatic event is we call it sometimes the reptilian brain. So if you think about a snake or a lizard, they don't have a lot of higher level thought or reasoning going on. That limbic system in our brain is really responsible for keeping us alive and alerting us to a threat. So when we've been in a traumatic event, or if you've been in combat, life-threatening situations for 6 months to a year, that part of the brain is going to be a little bit different because it's going to be more apt and in tune with threats in our environment. So that's where some of those symptoms come from. When a traumatic event occurs, the language processing and reasoning in our brain shuts down. And I have a slide that we talk about that. The left part of our brain shuts down during a traumatic event. So there's not a lot of thought going on. There's not a lot of reasoning or logic going on. And so those memories, we call it kind of like a flashbulb memory, where you just get a flash of this event. We don't have an accurate view of that traumatic event because it happens so quickly, and it's just a flash of a memory that gets imprinted in our brain. And what happens with that memory and just that initial imprint is that we can then have distortions about what happened during that event, or we may see the events in a way that didn't actually occur. So that memory part of the traumatic event, again, is where a lot of those cognitive distortions, flashbacks, nightmares, and so on and so forth come from. And I talked about the survival mechanism. We talked about the amygdala. That is basically our alarm system in our brain. If you think about your alarm system, if you have one or you've ever had one in your house, there are things that can trip that alarm system. If somebody opens the door without realizing you have the alarm on, it can go off and set off a false alarm. That amygdala codes our sensory information and those spheres. And so that's where, some of those triggers come up, and that alarm system in our brain can get set off when we have a trigger or we have something that reminds us of that event. And it takes a while for our brain, once that survival mechanism and alert system is turned on, to then turn it off. Because again, when that mechanism is on, the reasoning in our cortex is not engaged. So we're in that flight or flight survival mode. And it takes a while for our body to come down and relax from that. And that anxiety mode can also, we talked about some of the physiological reactions, can increase our heart rate, can make us sweat, or our heart may race. Those are things that our body has designed to keep us alive if we were in a threat situation, because we have adrenaline going on. We can do things like run faster or escape somebody who's trying to attack us. So again, that part of our brain is meant to keep us alive in those life-threatening situations. And so again, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, it comes from this part of our brain that's designed to keep us alive. So our left part of the brain is our language center. That's where we get our speech, our details, our logic, and that's the part of the brain that shuts down during trauma. Our right side of the brain is our nonverbal, our imagination, creative, insight, and intuition. So again, when we experience trauma or we experience anxiety, that left part of the brain that's responsible for our reasoning shuts down. Memories. So memories of life-threatening events, again, are not stored in the same area of the brain as other memories. They get stored with that survival mechanism in that other area of the brain. The memories are stored in the limbic system, which controls the survival reflexes and connects to other areas of the body necessary to survival, such as our adrenaline, our heart rate, and our muscles. And these memories are not linear or logical. They're very highly emotionally charged. So sometimes you might have somebody in a workplace setting that a coworker, and they get really upset about something that doesn't seem logical or linear. And what's happening in that situation is that individual is highly emotionally charged because that threat was triggered. So only 40% of the veterans who screen positive for a serious mental health problem ever seek treatment from a mental health provider. People with post-traumatic stress disorder have difficulty communicating, forming relationships. Talked about some of this before, may have inappropriate boundaries, may be perceived as hostile or aggressive. So those are some of the barriers when somebody comes forward and tries to get help, is that they do come across as difficult to communicate with and so on and so forth. And again, most of the individuals who are suffering are not identifying and coming forward for help. So treatment for PTSD, I don't want to give out any false information. So I want us to remember that when an individual goes for treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, it's difficult. It requires that the individual looks at the trauma and probably faces some of those fears that the threat response has created, and so on and so forth. So that treatment can be very difficult and distressing because it causes us to look at those parts, that trauma that we've been avoiding and pushing down and trying to get out of our mind. The positive aspect of treatment is that it helps rewire our brain. So instead of having that constant threat and so on and so forth, it helps us engage that cortex a little bit more, which is responsible for our higher level of thinking and reasoning and logic. Avoidance increases the fear and strengthens the fear circuit in the brain. So avoidance contributes to a more chronic course of post-traumatic stress disorder. So in treatment, we again face that trauma and face some of those fears. So it helps, again, helps us with that avoidance piece. But again, it is difficult for individuals to go through treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And facing the fear rewires that fear circuit. However, it does often cause a lot of distress. So if you have a friend or a family member or a coworker who's going through treatment for their post-traumatic stress disorder, it's probably very difficult for them, and the symptoms may get a little bit worse while they're going through that treatment process, especially during the initial phases. So we talked about less than half of the people from Iraq or Afghanistan actually get help. Many of them believe that the mental health care doesn't work. Some people have difficulty scheduling appointments at work or getting time off of work. And then there's still a perception that they'll be perceived as weak. So some of the goals of treatment is to help the client organize their memories without re-traumatizing them, helping them remember, process, and organize the memories. We talked about how those memories are flash bulbs and just imprinted on our brain, so we have to take a step back and slowly kind of process that and reorganize those memories so it's not so it's easier to deal with. The symptoms decrease as memories become more organized. Developing a rating scale for anxiety during the sessions and outside of the sessions. So this means if you're able to rate your anxiety or distress on a scale of 1 to 10, so if you say, okay, my anxiety is triggered right now and I'm at an 8, just being able to label that on a scale of 1 to 10 helps you feel more in control, because you're realizing, okay, this is an 8, this isn't the absolute worst, and maybe I can get it down to a 7. And so again, it helps you feel more in control of that anxiety. And if you are at a 10, you can say, hey, I'm at a 10, but I've been at a 10 before, so I know that I'm going to make it through this. And again, implementing some of those coping strategies and things that you've learned in treatment to get it down to a 9 or an 8 if you're at a 10. So some of the positive coping strategies that you can implement, the first and foremost is exercise, because exercise has been shown to decrease anxiety and depression in as little as 10 minutes per day. broken up over three times per day. So if you can go out and go for a walk a couple times a day, that's going to have a huge impact on those symptoms. It doesn't have to be running a marathon or going to a class at the gym for an hour. It can be simply just getting up and moving. You can get outside, that's also helpful. Developing personal relationships. Social support is key to helping with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's so difficult to do that and take that first step and reach out to people and put that effort in, but the payoff is huge. So if you have individuals who you already know who are fairly supportive, friends that you have, reach out to them, give them a call, even if you haven't talked to them in a few years. Family members, reach out, give them a call, and just chat with them. And then reach out to possibly other individuals and form new relationships through support groups, or if you have an activity that you used to enjoy, trying to develop some of those habits and interests again, although that can be pretty challenging until some of the PTSD is under control. Spiritual practices have been shown to help. We've now recognized that there's a moral injury that happens with post-traumatic stress disorder in individuals who have experienced a traumatic event, because it does often involve that violence and that death or threat of death. So that is a very spiritual matter. So re-engaging those spiritual practices, no matter what your beliefs are, is supportive and helps us cope. That can also help us build supportive relationships as well. Developing a sense of safety, maybe taking self-defense classes, and avoiding any substances such as alcohol or tranquilizers that increase our emotional discontrol. Some resources. These are some links that have some very good resources for PTSD. The VA has a great website. The website that they have does not just have information on PTSD for veterans. There's a lot of resources on there that are really great. You can look at the VA and DoD treatment guidelines for post-traumatic stress disorder. Psychology Tools has some great worksheets on there, so you can get more information again about what we talked about how the memories are organized, and they have information about that limbic system in the brain and so on and so forth. The Center for Deployment Psychology is also very useful, and then you also have the DSM-5, which outlines the actual criteria of diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. And then these are my references and the things that I've used to develop this training.